If you have questions, it would be great to type those into the chat box and we will answer the questions at the end of the webinar. And we ask that you please do complete the evaluation when the webinar is over. The web address is listed here, go.illinois.edu/EENLCassess. Or if you have a smartphone, you can pull it out. And if you have the camera and point it at that QR code, it will pull up the web address automatically. And that will be really helpful for us to improve on our programming and get your feedback. And so with that, it looks like we have a good number of folks. Resume the slideshow. So I think we can go ahead and get started, at least with introducing ourselves, if that works for everyone. I'll start with myself, and then I'll have Abigail and Gemini introduce themselves. So I'll start with my video so you can see a friendly face, but I will be turning it off for the presentation just to save some bandwidth. So my name is Allison Neubauer. I work for the Illinois-Indiana Sea Grant, and I am a Great Lakes Outreach Associate. And so I work on a variety of issues, including Great Lakes science and literacy, working with teachers and students, as well as I'm part of the pollution prevention team. In pollution prevention, we deal with issues like microplastics, emerging contaminants, and then we also run a program called Lawn to Lake, which is the foundation for some of this information, focusing on natural lawn care and improving water quality through more natural lawn care practices. And so with that, I'll turn it over to Abigail.
Yeah, hi, my name's Abigail Garofalo. I'm an energy and environmental stewardship educator for University of Illinois Extension, serving Cook County. So I am in the north, but we've hopefully kind of adapted and made this series to be applicable across the state. I work with the Master Naturalist program in Cook County, as well as a program called Conservation at Home, which Allison will talk a little bit more in our intro. And conservation landscape practices, including natural lawn care, is one of our main focuses when it comes to that program in particular. So I'll be talking a little bit, and I'll let Jamie introduce herself as well.
Okay, hi everybody. My name is Gemini Bhalsod. I'm a horticulture educator with the University of Illinois Extension. I helped co-develop this program with Abigail, Allison, and our lovely Master Gardener and Master Naturalist volunteers. And today I'll be facilitating and will co-present also next week.
Thank you, Gemini. And so with that, I think the first order of business will be to go over the handouts. And if you registered for this meeting, you should have received also a link to a box.com folder that has the handouts that are relevant to this webinar, both this week and next week. So this is just a screenshot that shows you what you should be seeing if you follow the link. I believe either Gemini or Abigail can post that into the chat again if they haven't already, so you can pull it up. And you can follow along as we go through, or if you want to just have these handy to review afterwards. Today, the most relevant pieces will be this number 1, the Lawn to Lake Guidebook, is sort of the all-encompassing resource that talks about natural lawn care, why it's important, and also goes into the specific strategies and principles that you can apply on your property. We have information about watersheds, fertilizers, composting as fertilizers, turf grass, different turf grass species and varieties. And some of these we'll get into more specifically next week in the strategy section. Information about conservation at home, pollinator gardens, rain gardens, and then the focus of this week's webinar is the assessment document. So that piece here, the first page, will be helping you look at and assess your property and start to think about what your goals are for your lawn. So hopefully everyone is able to access these documents. You can type in the chat if you're having issues and follow along as we go through. And so as Abigail mentioned, this workshop and this webinar are part of the Conservation at Home program. And the goal of Conservation at Home is to promote landscape conservation practices using more ecological approaches. One way they do that is by offering free public programs, including this webinar today, that educate residents on conservation landscape practices, not only natural lawn care, but also things like composting, native landscape design, etc. And they also recognize residents who are doing these practices. You can become certified as a conservation at home property. And there's some specific criteria, which if you want to learn more about, you can visit the website at the top left, go.illinois.edu/conservation-at-home. For some of that more specific criteria and information about the program. It's part of the Conservation Foundation, and it's run through other organizations in different counties. So for example, up here in Cook County, Conservation at Home is a partnership between the Forest Preserves and the University of Illinois Extension. And let's see, Sea Grant, as I mentioned, I am with the Illinois-Indiana Sea Grant. And for anyone who's not familiar, Sea Grant is actually a national network, and it's all university-based programs administered through NOAA, the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration. So just as there are land grant universities, there are also sea grant universities. So here, Illinois, Indiana, we have the University of Illinois at Champaign-Urbana, as well as Purdue University in West Lafayette, Indiana, are our host institutions. And our mission is to use research, outreach, and education to enhance the use and conservation of our coastal resources. So here in Illinois, Indiana, our coast, so to speak, is Lake Michigan and the Great Lakes. And so we work on a variety of topics, including aquatic invasive species, aquaculture, sustainable community planning, climate change, and pollution prevention, as I mentioned earlier, which brings us to our Lawn to Lake program and some of our natural lawn care outreach efforts. So to start the webinar series, we thought it was really important to talk about why natural lawn care is important and how our lawns are affecting everyone, folks beyond ourselves. And so we thought a good way to start that would be to poll the audience. So we want to ask everyone here, hopefully you'll be seeing this poll now and you can start entering your answers. Do you live in a watershed? We'll give about 40 seconds. Make sure everyone has a chance to see the poll and answer. Got about 10 more seconds. If you don't know, give your best guess, and rest assured we will be talking about it some more, so no worries. All right, things are slowing down, so I'm going to go ahead and close the polling in 5 seconds. And I will share the results. All right, so everyone should be seeing that now. We have 61% of folks saying that they do live in a watershed, 39% saying no. And as some of you picked up in the chat box, this wasn't meant to be a trick question, but we did not, in fact, tell you what a watershed was. So this was just to sort of see our understandings of watersheds before going into some of this information. So I'll stop sharing the polls and give you that critical piece of information that you were missing. So a watershed is an area of land in which all the precipitation drains into a single body of water. So if you look at this picture here, sorry, let me go back. If you look at this photo here, you can see in the background, we have rainfall falling down, and based on the topography of the land, the high places, water flows from high to low areas. So it will run into streams, rivers, and ultimately end up in lakes, oceans. And so any area of land that drains to the same body of water is in the same watershed. So we look at this map here. This is the major watersheds of Illinois, and you can see the entire state is covered. So in fact, we all do live in a watershed, and there are watersheds at different scales. In your local neighborhood, you could have a watershed that runs into a nearby lake or river, and ultimately those contribute to larger watersheds like we see here. and most of the state of Illinois all flows up eventually into the Mississippi River, which goes down into the Gulf of Mexico. And now thinking back to lawns, the reason why we're here today, this map here is from the NASA Earth Observatory, and they conducted a study to quantify how much land surface in the United States is covered by lawns. So these green, this green color here, the darker green it is, the greater the fraction of turf grass in that area. And you can see that typically where there's people, there are lawns. So our major metropolitan areas are very clear on this map to see where the lawns are located in the United States. And if we tie in that watershed concept again, and you'll see this is that Mississippi River watershed that I mentioned, there are folks from a great amount of the United States that are all contributing to the watershed. And so these big hotspots of lawn are all contributing to the water quality of ultimately the Gulf of Mexico, but all of those local bodies of water in between as well. And if you were to quantify and put a number on turf grass, which is exactly what that study sought out to do, there are over 40 million acres of turf grass in the United States. And so to put that into some context, the state of Illinois is about 37 million acres. So if we could take each of our little postage stamps of lawn and put them together, we would more than cover the entire state of Illinois with turf grass. In fact, there's 3 times more turf grass than irrigated corn in the United States. And to look at that a little differently, here are some bar graphs. I'm a visual person myself. I think it's helpful to see on the top here, the irrigated land. Lawn is way more than if you combined alfalfa, corn, soybeans, and orchard. In fact, it's almost double the 4 of those combined. So there's a lot of land going to lawn. And as a consequence, on that bottom chart there, you can see we're putting a lot of water into our lawns as well. So that's one of the major inputs. Obviously, when you think about taking care of your lawn, and there's a significant impact on a national scale of lawns. A typical suburban lawn will take 10,000 gallons of water, but there's other hidden costs of lawn care too. So we're putting 580 million gallons of gasoline into our lawnmowers. We're using 3 million tons of fertilizer and 67 million pounds of pesticides. And when I'm talking about pesticides, I'm referring to insecticides, herbicides, fungicides, that broad class of chemicals that are designed to kill unwanted organisms. And often the biological processes in those pesticides are not unique to the intended target. So you're also having an impact on things like soil microbes and other beneficial insects, ladybugs, pollinators. So it's something to really think about. And that stat on the bottom, I think, raises an interesting point. Homeowners use 3 times more pesticide per acre than farmers. So, it's easy to point fingers at someone else for being the problem for, issues in the environment, but we all have a role to play. And I think as homeowners, we all have a very important role to educate ourselves and be a bit more targeted and informed in our approach to lawn care and think about some alternative options. So what is natural lawn care? I think the easiest way to think about it is by comparing it to what we consider conventional lawn care. What most of us probably, or most of our neighbors are doing, is more of a one-size-fits-all approach, and it's very product-based. So you have a problem, you go to the store, you buy a product to fix it. And you're really just treating the symptoms and getting a short-term fix when you're doing this type of lawn care. As opposed to natural lawn care, this is really focused on the health of, first and foremost, your soil, because your soil is the foundation for a healthy turf plant. And then you're being more targeted and using natural and organic products only when needed. So we are going to talk about taking a soil test, and that's really important to diagnose issues, and then be more calculated in what you're applying to your lawn, in what amounts, and at what time. And this is really treating underlying problems, not just the symptoms. So today we're going to talk about the assessment steps for how you assess your property. We're going to touch on soil testing, choosing the right plant for the right place. And then we're going to dive into that site assessment tool, which is part 1 of the series. And then next week, if you're able to join us, we'll go into some more specific strategies and talk about the action plan tool. So now that we know why we need natural lawn care, let's talk about how we can do it. The first thing with site assessment is to understand why we assess our yards. We need a baseline to understand our site and know when things are going wrong. That will help us to properly diagnose our problems and understand what solutions are best suited for our site. So if you're taking an assessment, it follows a general set of steps. First, you need to list the needs of your site, and that's the why and the what of your site. And then you can study it and draw a map and use that information so you can prioritize your goals. Because we may have a lot of things we want for our lawns, but realistically we can't do everything. So I think it's important to think critically about what's most important to you, how much time and effort and money you're willing to invest, and prioritize your goals. So we have another question here for you all. I will cue the poll. And we want to know from the participants here today, how do you use your lawn? I think you are able to pick more than one, but start with your most important use of your lawn. All right, we're slowing down. I'll give it about 10 more seconds to get your answers in. All right, I'm going to end the polling and I will share the results for everyone to see. So the number one response is appearance, followed closely by entertainment space, use for pets, yard games, children's play area, and quite a few other. If you want to put in the chat box what you were thinking of when you selected other, I'd be curious to see what other uses. Wildlife habitat, that's great. Required by your homeowners association. Native flowers and rain garden. Pollinators, wonderful. Gardening, that's a big one. Great, thank you all so much for sharing. So obviously there are countless reasons why we might want our yard to be the way that it is. And it's important to think about your needs when you are thinking about how you're going to manage your lawn so that you're very intentional. So here are some other options we might have be thinking about. If you want privacy, a space for as an outdoor living area, garden, you mentioned garden, a lot of folks, a place for children to play, for pets. These are all important things to consider right off the bat. You also need to think about what your tolerance is for things like weeds and bare spots. At one point, Clover, which we see here on the left, was actually included in lawn mixes. And that's it fixes nitrogen into the soil. It's not a bad thing necessarily, but if that's something you can't stand, you need to be upfront and sort of think about those considerations at the get-go. And other things like bare areas, problems with your site, and how much you're willing to invest to correct those issues. The next thing you need to consider is knowing your site. So things like sunlight, soil, drainage are important to note. Sunny areas get 6 or more hours of full sun, and they'll give you warm, dry soils, whereas shady sites under trees or against north-facing walls are going to have cooler, damper soils. If you have sandy soil, you will have drier soils. It will drain more quickly. Loamy soil is a mix of sand, silt, clay, and organic matter, so it will drain well and hold into moisture and nutrients better. Clay soil is more small particles, will be heavy and sticky, can get soggy and waterlogged, and will hold on to nutrients better than sandy soil as well. Drainage is really critical to think about. You should know how the soil drains on your property and choose plants and place them in the appropriate spots. If your water is draining too quickly, your plants might not have a chance to absorb enough moisture and you're going to need to water more often. Or if your water is draining too slowly, your plants might actually suffocate or rot. So it's important to consider either fixing the drainage issues or choosing plants that will thrive in those conditions. Other considerations are structures that might be shading out certain spots of your lawn or causing obstructions, say for your plant's root system. So think about things like sidewalks, driveways, utility lines, and sort of plot those out on your property and know something to consider. Another issue here in Illinois, we have problems with salt, as you can see in this photo here. So just sort of taking a look at your property and assessing what it looks like and what issues you see, and planning from there how to address those issues. And with that, I'm going to hand it over to Abigail to start with soil testing.
Okay, sorry, I had like a lot going on my screen. So with soil testing, one thing I was going to add about drainage, I don't know how, every part of the state has gotten when it came to rain lately, but yesterday, I live in Des Plaines, it rained pretty much all day and even plans to rain today. And let me tell you, I know exactly what the drainage patterns are on the area around my apartment complex. So it might be a good time to check that out if you've had a little bit of rain or a lot of rain, depending on where you are. So soil testing, like we mentioned earlier, soil testing, soil health is the basis for natural lawn care because it ties to a lot of the underlying issues you may have, and also just assessing your property in general. Soil is the medium for providing essential water, nutrients, and air for your plants. And healthy soils tend to be less appealing to weeds. And by testing our soil, we know that actually prevention is cheaper than a cure. And these soil tests are actually pretty inexpensive to get one of these done. It can be about $10 to $30 depending on where you go. So that's pretty cheap to get like a wealth of background information that you need to be able to make informed decisions about plant choice, design, additives such as fertilizers. It tells you a lot of information for such a low cost. So to take a soil test, you have to go through a lab and you have to gather a soil sample. And so you can actually get a soil kit from, in Cook County, we get them from the local Farm Bureau. If you're not sure, always start with your local extension office. But then once you get your kit, you have to gather your soil in your yard. And so we found that we have this really wonderful video with extension that shows you how to gather a soil test. And so I'm going to play it and we're just going to take a minute to watch it to really see what this looks like on how to gather soil for a soil test. Realize I should have checked the sound beforehand.
One of the best things a first-time gardener can do, whether it's going to be a vegetable bed, a flower bed, or a shrub border, is to have a soil test done. The question comes up then by the homeowner, how do I take that soil test? And I've just created an imaginary garden here marked out by the red flags, and within that garden space you need to take several samples so that when you get all done you have a composite or representative sample of your garden soil. That's the case when the garden is generally uniform and the same. If you have a part of your yard that stands water that's lower than another part of the yard or higher than another part of the yard, that soil test might be different. So you might want to sample that location separately. But in general, if the soils are reasonably uniform, you would take multiple groups of samples from that garden, mix them all together, and that becomes your soil test. You want to take more than one sample, because if you only took one sample, that only tells you what the soil was like in that one singular spot and is not representative of the whole garden. So in this case here, I've chosen to come in from the ends, So I've got 1, 2, 3 samples, a couple 3 feet in from the corners, and one in the middle here in my imaginary 10 by 10 or 12 by 12 garden. So the next step at this point, now that you've figured out where you're going to take your samples, is to actually take that sample. The typical way we would do that is you dig a hole 6 or 8 inches deep. You then take a garden trowel and just slice down the entire soil profile. Take that amount of soil, place it in the bucket. Now you can do that multiple times in this hole, but you need to do and repeat that same process in all the locations where you expect to take the sample. After you have taken that sample from those 3 locations, in this case, you're going to mix them together, making sure the sample is uniform, that you have that vertical set of profile in the bucket, and from there you take about 1 cupful of soil, typically placed in a paper bag. So after you've got your sample and you've placed it in the paper bag to air dry, and again that really is just using a cupful, you want to contact perhaps your local county extension office or your local farm bureau to find out which lab will provide you that test.
Okay, so like Richard had mentioned, you'll want to take it from multiple places across your yard or your lawn, unless you have a spot that's very distinctly different. So if you have a very distinctly low depression in your yard, you'll definitely want to test that separately, just to understand, how that could be different. Now I do have the soiltesting.org up here. That's the Illinois Soil Testing Association. That's where you can find labs. However, I do think they're transitioning over to the Agricultural Laboratory Testing Association, but that link will lead you directly there. So, and you can even distinguish that you would like a turf, lawn, garden test. So keeping that in mind when you're thinking about when you're getting your soil test. Now you've sent in your soil, or you've collected your sample, you've sent it in, and now you have your results back, and you just got a whole wealth of information, but not really sure what to do with it. And so when you read a soil test, this is what we've kind of talked about as being a really important features of it. So the first one is soil pH. Now in Illinois, we tend to have more alkaline soils. That means, on a scale of 1 to 14, 14 is alkaline or basic, 1 is acidic. And so a soil pH between 6.5 and 7, maybe even a little higher than that, like a 7.2, 7.3, that is normal. And so keeping that idea in mind when you're reading your pH. Another important factor of your soil test results will be soil organic matter. That's the dead stuff in your soil that makes that really rich, dark color. You'll want at least 3%, but usually not more than 5%. Organic matter acts as a sponge for water, helping preventing pooling and runoff, and it improves the soil structure. If you have, upwards of like 20%, 15%, things like that, you start to get more of a bog or a muck type soil. And so, just kind of depending on a typical yard, 5% is pretty rich in organic matter. Other things you'll want to pay attention to is the nutrients. There's primary nutrients like nitrogen, phosphorus, potassium. Those should sound kind of familiar if you've used fertilizer before. That's the NPK. And the secondary nutrients, which are calcium, magnesium, and sulfur. All of these are important for plant health. And when it comes to these nutrient numbers, you'll want to pay attention to extreme low or high results. And so we have an example here of a soil test result that came back. And the soil pH was 7.2, which for Illinois, we were like, that's pretty normal. But if you notice the bar for phosphorus, this green bar right here, it goes all the way to very high. That means that there's a lot of phosphorus in this soil that was tested. And so how this could inform your practice is, maybe you need to add maybe you do want to add fertilizer, but you should not be adding any fertilizer with phosphorus in it. And so keeping track of that will help you inform your practice and save money, reduce runoff, and pollutants in the water. And just to kind of demonstrate why a soil test might be, is really important, is that these images here show a nutrient deficiency in grass species, but they don't, the look of it could mean a couple of different things. So in the image on the right, it's like this golden yellow color, it's kind of mottled. That could be as a result of iron deficiency or nitrogen deficiency, but you wouldn't know unless you got a soil test. And the image on the left, that's also long-term nutrient deficiency. And so again, showing that, you know, getting a baseline so that way you have an understanding of where your soil nutrients are over time will be really helpful in diagnosing these issues. So there's a take-home messages for, you know, soil testing generally. Again, it gives you this baseline measurement that can inform your practices and prevent you from over-fertilizing, which not only saves our water, but saves you money, right? You don't want to throw anything on your lawn and then have the next rainstorm take it out with it. You want to keep whatever you put on your lawn be actually used by the plants. And so keeping track of that will be really helpful. You'll also want to take, like Richard had mentioned, multiple samples across your lawn area, so that way you have kind of a general basis of what your lawn is. The only reason you would want to test something separately is if it's a very distinctly different kind of space. Either it's a really low depression, there's a very specific area that's not growing well for that you can't quite figure out. There's no other difference other than it's just not growing well. That might be another reason you want to test something different. Again, going to soiltesting.org for labs would be really helpful. Again, they've kind of switched over to a different lab testing site, but that website will lead you to that. And you can you can add on there, you can pick a lab that will test for turf, garden type soil results. Because if you don't distinguish, they'll automatically default to agricultural recommendations, and that might not be exactly what you want if you're testing your lawn. When reading your results, you'll want to pay close attention to the soil, pH, organic matter, and the organic matter. And then again, we just kind of recommend that you retest every 3 to 5 years. So you have that understanding of long-term where your soil nutrients are, any changes that are occurring over time. And then anytime that you're doing a new planting or remodel, you'll want to look at that as well. So we've, you know, given you a lot of information about what, like what's going on with your lawn. You know, what do you want? What is the current state of your soil, of the, you know, the sunlight, the water, everything like that. And so that helps you make decisions for the right plant in the right place. Another word that we have, or another like term we have for this, is don't fight the site. Essentially, using all this assessment information you've gathered, taking all this data and using that to make informed choices about what you put in your lawn. So we know that when a plant is healthy, it requires less watering, reduces or eliminates the needs for pesticides, and is more resilient when it comes to diseases and harsh weather. I like to think of it as like a human. So when I don't get a lot of sleep, when I'm really stressed at work, and when I've been eating not very well, like junk food and things like that, my immune system tends to take a hit, and I'm more likely to get a cold or you know, just sick in general. And plants are very similar to that. If they're in an environment where they're not growing well, they're going to be less resilient, more likely to not handle stress well. And so we want to make sure that we put our plants in the right place for where they are going to be healthy and happy. So we do right plant, right place by looking at two things. We plan first and plant once. And then we also want to make sure we know the plants. So we've gotten to know the site, and then we want to make sure we know the plants that we're putting in our lawns, in our spaces. And so by incorporating the results of your assessment, you're able to plan for what needs to go there. If there's a space like Allison was talking about, a shaded area, maybe knowing that a plant needs more sunlight, it shouldn't go in that space. Another thing you'll want to plan for is the long term. So for example, if you have and this kind of goes into knowing your plants, if you plant a young tree and you know eventually it's going to get very large and shade out a lot of your yard underneath of it, know that that's going to be the size of that tree eventually, and that the plants that are growing underneath that space will now need to have more of be shade tolerant plants. And again, so that goes with knowing your plants. Again, that mature size of the plant. This image on the right here kind of shows that there's grass that looks like it was trying to grow underneath what I think is the sycamore tree, if I had to guess. And there's lots of bare spots because the grass needs more sunlight than the tree is allowing to come through. Knowing and understanding flooded conditions, if you know that you get a lot of flooding in the spring based on your assessment, understand that every spring that plant that maybe doesn't tolerate wet feet or really flooded conditions is not going to do as well in the spring and could be susceptible to diseases. Another thing to consider that is where you are in the state. And so if you're in Southern Illinois, you're actually in a transitional zone for warm versus cool season grasses. So warm season grass, they're essentially, like, I like to think of them as opposites, but warm season grasses are more resilient to drought as their name states, they like warmer and drier temperatures. So their growing season tends to be shorter in Illinois as opposed to maybe a warm season grass in Florida. A common lawn turf warm season grass is zoysia grass. Another native one is buffalo grass, is a native warm season grass. But their growing season tends to be when it's hot and warm. And so, come spring and fall, when it's cooler, you're going to have dormant or brown grass. Cool season grasses actually go dormant in the summer if they're not watered, right? So we can water them and they'll stay nice and green. But if you just allow them to do their natural thing, they'll go dormant when it's really hot out. But they'll also be greener a lot earlier in the season. So all of you, I'm assuming most of you have green grasses right now. If you had a warm season grass in your yard, that's not exactly would be the case. You'd have to wait a month or two for your grass to get green. So it just kind of depends, understanding those differences. Again, salt tolerance, like Allison mentioned, we always have to consider that, especially when it's adjacent to a sidewalk or walkway. This image on the left is like one of my favorite explanations for why we need to consider salt tolerance, as this was maybe not considered when this building was landscaped. As you can see, the bottom of those bushes are brown, and then the edges all along the sidewalk, there is no plants growing there. So all of that information seems like a lot and really overwhelming, and you're like, well, I got to keep pages and pages of notes and keeping track of that just to inform my decision making. This seems like a lot. Well, we've actually created a tool, a document, in order to help you keep track of your assessments. And so we have a lawn care assessment, like a lawn assessment document. And this is located in the resources folder that Allison showed you in the very beginning. You're welcome to download it. It is a fillable PDF. You can also print it and write on it as well, but it's a fillable PDF as an option if you're like not in the feeling of printing things these days. So I'm just going to talk a little bit on how to fill this out. And so the top is just the general background section. So, putting the year, where is your lawn, what percentage of your yard is lawn? Maybe, you have a patio or something, so not all of it is lawn. How much of it is it in full sun? It's really important to the health of some of these turf species. And on that note, adding your lawn species we have a line for that. Now, I do understand that not everyone may know. I'm personally in the market for looking for a house, and getting to know like what your species is if you just bought it and you weren't the one who planted it, that can be really difficult. Do your best guess. You know, if you added a sunshade mix, that's enough detail to tell you something, right? You'll also, like we asked you earlier, want to write down the use of your lawn. All of this information helps you make informed decisions about what you want to do when you manage it, which is what we talk about a lot in part 2. So that's kind of this top half. The second half is a seasonal snapshot of a lot of different conditions of your lawn. And so, you know, we recognize that one of them, that second one right here, is about pooling water and drainage. Your water situation might look very different in the spring compared to the summer, right? And so that's a way of getting snapshots of what your water looks like at different parts of the year. And so we look at lawn condition, just kind of a general description, water, any shade that could change throughout the year depending on, you know, I don't know if you put something up new or whatever, problem weeds, diseases, any other notable issues, taking note of your additives such as pesticides, herbicides, compost, and then any other notable practices. When are you aerating? If you are aerating, are you irrigating? Things like that. So I'm going to show you an example of how we, what this would look like filled out. And we just filled it out for the spring. So this individual filled out their assessment document today, or maybe this year, 2020, front yard, and about 75% of it is lawn. They have 90% full sun, and it's a full sun lawn mix. They really like it for recreation and appearance. That's the reason that they have it. And I forgot to note this earlier, there is this note about soil test results and property map, not like integral, like don't think that you can't move forward with this filling this out if you don't have it. But as we had mentioned earlier, soil testing will give you a lot more information. And so just kind of getting a full on assessment document on what the state of your lawn is will be really helpful. And we don't talk too much about making a property map, but just like a really easy sketch of like what's going on with your yard. What does it physically look like would be really helpful. So moving on to these kind of seasonal conditions that we talked about, or that this individual has in their lawn. When they were asked what like the general description of their lawn was in the spring, it's wet and soggy. And let me tell you, that's what my courtyard in my apartment complex looks like right now. So this is pretty accurate if we were talking about mine, even though we're not. There's pooling, water, and drainage issues. It's mainly in the middle of the lawn and by the downspout. So this tells this individual a lot already, that where the water is physically going on their property. Tells, they wrote about how they have some shade from underneath a tree, and then they even wrote about what the state of their lawn is underneath their tree. So it's a thin and patchy lawn underneath that. So I'm already starting to think, maybe that has something to do with the shade. So I'm getting a lot of information just as I'm writing this down. Keeping track of my problem weeds or diseases is really important for management of your weeds and diseases. So writing those down like, oh, this is an issue, things like that. Another notable issue to keep track of is these bare areas. So like if I kept track of this throughout the season, I might know, you know, what the cause of this bare area is. For this, I might be thinking, if it's along the driveway, maybe that has something to do with the winter salt that I added the season before. Additives, they're fertilizing around Mother's Day. That's really common, right? To just be like, I fertilize around this holiday. So keeping track of that as well. And then this is their notable mowing, like they mow in the spring after it dries up. So this is just one way that you can fill this out. Again, this is in that document on, or this is in that folder that we sent you online. It's a box folder. So I encourage you to take a look at it, and now would be a great time to assess your lawn for spring. Now, to give you a little preview of next week's class or webinar is we'll be creating this action plan. So we, after you've taken some time to assess what you want, maybe figuring out what your goals are to focus on for the year when it comes to managing your lawn. And so looking at these goals And we'll be actually talking about very concrete, specific strategies you can do to address some of these goals of managing weeds, managing your water, whether too much or too little, reducing your lawn area if that's an interest of yours, reducing your costs, not putting as much money into your lawn. It just kind of depends on what you want. And so this will be kind of our part 2, is making this action plan. Oh, and I zoom into it, apparently. I'd forgotten that I had done that. So just to kind of wrap up a little bit about assessment, and again, here's that preview for those goals for the next class. But we really want to assess to understand what's best suited for our site. And so not only what you want, but what is going on your property. And so both of those pieces are essential for understanding how to address issues in your lawn. And it just gives you a baseline for understanding when things do go wrong. Say you've done an assessment in 2019 and nothing was wrong, and now all of a sudden 2020, you're having all of these weed issues, a lot of patches are dying. You'll know that something happened in between that time, and that it wasn't something, maybe that happened before that, because you had a good record of what happened the year before. And again, just to keep with that basis of natural lawn care, it helps us properly diagnose our lawns. So again, next week we'll be looking at these like 9 or so or 8 goals to really figure out, how can we address these with some concrete strategies. So I really highly encourage you to sign up for next week, and I'll have that link on there if that's something that you're interested in. These are our contact information. So Gemini, who's our facilitator today, and myself and Allison, we all developed this together. And these are also on the right, there are links to the Conservation at Home program, if that's something that you're like, oh, that sounds interesting. And the Lawn to Lakes program, which also has a lot of wonderful resources. On the top right is the evaluation QR code. So if, we would love if you filled that out. We really want that, that feedback from you to figure out how we can improve new webinars that we could offer, things like that. So there's so many things so much information that you have that we would love to know from you in this evaluation. So please, please, please fill that out. I don't think I have any more information. I'm actually going to go to the next slide that has the information for next week's webinar, as well as still the links and everything. So I think we have time for questions. So if we'd like to do that. Yeah.
Great, thank you so much, Allison and Abigail. We have been answering questions as they have been coming in. So many of you have gotten your questions answered, but a couple did come through. So the first one we have right here that I didn't get a chance to answer quite yet, but could you discuss any recommendations for native grasses to replace turf? I know you did mention buffalo grass, and so if you just wanted to restate that, that would be great.
Yeah, so buffalo grass is a native warm season grass. So it is one of those grasses that will be really, really tolerant and really beautiful in the summer, but come like this season right now, it'll be brown. And in the spring, it'll be brown. So it just kind of depends on what you want. If you live in Southern Illinois, buffalo grass might be a really good option for you. One thing we have talked about is trying not to mix your warm season and cool season grasses, or not just trying, just don't do it. It's not recommended because they tend to like compete with each other, and the warm season kind of wins, and you'll end up with some really weird brown spots in your yard. And so it's not recommended to do like a mix of a warm season and a cool season, but buffalo grass is the best alternative we've found to like a grass species that's native, and it has really wonderful deep roots with it. I'm not so sure about like a cool season recommendation. Allison, do you happen to know like a cool season grass native recommendation?
So I don't have a good answer for cool season natives. I did post just now in the chat box a link to A-list turf. So it's not necessarily native, but there are species of cool season grasses that are being cultivated to be low input. And so this might be a good option if that was kind of where you were going with wanting native species. These have lower water requirements and lower maintenance requirements. And so that's typically more of like a tall fescue, blends of different cultivars of tall fescue is typically the low input options for cool season grasses in Illinois.
Great. And then I think Diane just sent me pen sedge, but I haven't looked that up yet, but I think it was a private message. So I wanted to share that with everybody here. The next question is from Peter. He's asking about the labs on the soiltesting.org are geared for agricultural use. And so where can you find a testing site for residential or turf sites? That's a really good question, Peter, and I will take that if that's okay with the team. Many of these labs that, although they are geared for agricultural sites, what you can do is on their intake form, if you specify that it's for residential or for turf sites, then they might be able to give you better recommendations. So all of these sites will accept samples from residential areas, but it just depends on if the recommendations they give you back will be targeted for your actual garden. So all the labs should work, but you definitely want to specify or take their recommendations with a grain of salt if you don't.
I was going to add on that, IllinoisSoilTesting.org is, like I said, was transitioning to like the agricultural, like lab soil something. It's on the website, and they, on their list of sites, they do have like soil testing labs. They do have like, some of them have like lawn and garden specific testing too. So that might be something further to look into as well.
Great, thank you. So then the next question is, what type of clover can I add to my lawn mix? By Jean is the question. And I think there are some micro clover cultivars out there. I don't know if Abigail or Allison, you know of specific clovers. I mean, the one that used to be sold in the lawn mixes was just a plain old white clover, so I don't think that one was anything special.
Yeah, I don't have much to add to that. Allison maybe knows more, but I don't. Sorry.
Yeah.
I don't have a specific clover either recommendation.
Then I can keep looking that up, but definitely look into micro clover cultivars. And then from Tess asks, how do you remedy high potassium and high phosphorus in soils?
I haven't come across that. Gemini, do you have any additions to that?
I think it, I was thinking about this question and then I thought I'd bring it to both of you also, but basically if your plants aren't showing toxicity to phosphorus or potassium, you wouldn't necessarily need to do any remediation for that. It's not like high pH or low pH where people can add sulfur or limestone for these elements, for potassium and phosphorus. You wouldn't really have to do anything unless you had your plants were exhibiting some toxicity to them, because soil particles are pretty good if there's enough of a clay content at holding on to potassium and phosphorus. I hope that's helpful. Let's see, the next question I have from Rachel is, what kinds of seeds do you recommend for low growing native mix? I think we had sent some of that in the chat, but I would recommend you looking at some of the handouts that were provided in the box folder that give plant recommendations. I know a lot of companies have like a low growing meadow mix, although I haven't used those. And then kind of going along with that, Laura asks, where can you find buffalo grass seed? Does anybody know?
That's hard because I mean, it's just not common up in Northern Illinois where we're at. We
I
don't.
do know Piso, the Piso nursery has done buffalo grass and has some resources, so that might be a good place to start. I can look up the link and put it in the chat. But I would agree, it's not as common up here in Northern Illinois. So Southern Illinois might be more resources. Sorry, go ahead, Jamie.
Yeah, and then someone just added Prairie Moon, a lot of those like big nurseries that maybe, I don't know if Midwest Ground Covers would, but you know, a lot of those big nurseries might be able to help with that. And then I'm seeing a lot of questions and conversation about sedge lawns. And so if this was your question, you know, be sure to, I think people have been responding and I really appreciate that. I don't have a lot of experience with sedge lawns. So please read through the chat box if that was something that you were had questions about. Great, someone's offering that Missouri Wildflowers has buffalo grass seed. So there are a lot of those, you know, those bigger nurseries that sell natives might have that. And someone else said also local land managers. Let's see if I missed any other questions here. There's been a few questions on water, areas where there's lots of water pooling, maybe moss, where grass doesn't grow as well. And I would encourage those people to take a look at your handouts. There's a lot of information about rain gardens and plants for rain gardens, and then also sign up for next week where we will be talking about rain gardens in a little bit more depth. And then I see this last question here. Another issue is not just a mix, but how do you go from a weedy lawn to native or low growing mix? Possibly we could answer that now, or maybe that's a future topic, but I would just suggest, you know, starting small with any sort of garden or lawn or turf conversion. You always want to start with something that's small and manageable as opposed to trying to do your whole garden and yard at once.
And I would just add to that next week when Jamie and Abigail cover the specific strategies for natural lawn care. These are things that take time, so definitely just what Jamie was saying, but you can overseed, and you should be overseeding regularly on your lawn, and so that will help increase the density of your turf grass and shade out weeds over time.
I always just say too, like being really, really diligent about maintenance when you do get those natives in there too, because they're very resilient once they're established, but while they're getting established, you'll want to make sure you really keep track of the weeds.
Great, and then I'm seeing some questions about, you know, specific weeds or specific lawn problems. And I, again, want to encourage these people to come on next week and please take the evaluation. I'm not sure if there's, so here's the registration. I just put it in there for next week where we will talk about specific strategies that have to do with, you know, water, with weeds, diseases, things like that. So I think that's all we have here. If anybody has other questions, you can put them in the chat box or unmute yourselves too. I'll stop my recording.
Yeah, I was just thinking I should
There we
stop.
go.